Hello, welcome to this podcast. And today I'm really delighted to bring you someone who has been a very important teacher for me, particularly in the field of constellations work and group work as well. And quite a few years ago, I was introduced to Gillian Kelly, as a constellator. However, let me tell you a little bit more about Gillian before we start. And today as well, I just wanted to say I've asked Gillian to come today on this podcast because I want to talk to her about her experience of working with communities and leading communities, or community, should I say, as well, because in my conversations with her, I was fascinated by her experience of this. So let me tell you a little bit more about Gillian. So Gillian is a psychotherapist, supervisor and trainer. She's retired now. And she had a private practice in the South Lakeland, so that's the Lake District in Northern England. And she still runs weekend workshops on family and generational constellations. And she always says she loves and continues to be excited by this work in particular. She trained originally at the Chiron Centre for Body Psychotherapy in West London, and where she was particularly drawn to the Gestalt element of the course. And then she took some further training with the Los Angeles Gestalt Institute in their European intensive programs. Eventually, she joined the staff at the Chiron Centre as a group leader and trainer in Gestalt body psychotherapy. In 1996, she came across Bert Hellinger's family constellations work and began to take every opportunity to experience and learn about this approach. So she actually studied with Bert Hellinger and other leading trainers, including Hunter Beaumont and Albrecht Marr. And then she trained with Franz Rupert, looking particularly at healing the generational effects of trauma through constellation. Her earlier background was in theatre, education and business. And she studied drama at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama and went on to train as a teacher in North London. After teaching drama and English for a number of years and running a vegetarian restaurant for some years too, she started training in this particular work. She was a participant and organizer of ongoing personal and professional development groups facilitated by Hunter Beaumont for 14 years. And this group was a continual source of instruction, growth and inspiration for her, and contributed enormously to the person that she says she is today, and a therapist. As well as all this work amazing work that she's done, she adores singing, Argentine tango, acting and writing. But the bit particularly I want to talk to Gillian about today is her work as an environmental activist. And she has got a very interesting story to tell about how she became an environmental activist as well. But she says that her life and work are increasingly concerned with the relationship with each other and the earth and the fate of human and other species too. So welcome, Gillian.
Thank you.
So the bit that I mentioned there is this story of you becoming an environmental activist. So, and how old were you when that happened? Let's start there. How old were you when you became an environmental activist? Because these days we kind of associate it with much younger people as well, don't we?
Well, I've been very concerned about what was happening to the planet since maybe the 70s. So through the 70s, 80s, 90s, first decade of 2000s, increasingly concerned about what was happening and the inaction that I saw. But I didn't, apart from donating, I did very little that you could call activism. But when fracking came to the Files near Blackpool, I got more and more interested in that, interested in the sense of appalled, really, in the sense of that it was a terrible thing that was happening and that the consequences would be terrible. And, you know, there was government was talking about really the whole of Northern England being a big industrial fracking complex, ruining the landscape, ruining the water, putting people's health in jeopardy. And I began to, I went to support one of the leading protagonists who was opposing it in court. And that was for me a big step. And then I went to the site very nervously, which was another big step. And eventually, really through my son, who was an activist, I eventually, at the age of 73, took action as a family, as 3 generations of our family did an action in front of the gates, blocking the gates, and so on, being arrested, which was a very new threshold for me to step over. So since then, I guess I've felt much more, but it was a threshold. And after stepping over that threshold, somehow things seemed different. My whole investment in being a certain kind of respectable, dignified person, I could let go of that and just see the urgency that is confronting us. So as a result of that, maybe I became more and more interested in all aspects of what was happening to the planet. And at a certain point, a young woman that I knew said she had read the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change report that they issued at the end of 2018, or in the autumn of 2018. And she said it was absolutely terrifying. It said we had only a limited time left to turn things around, and that nobody seemed to know about it, and anybody she mentioned it to was completely indifferent. And I said there are people who are concerned. There are a lot of people who are concerned. And so as a response to that and to her and to, at very short notice, I decided to give a talk here in Ambleside. And I put up a few posters and I told people by word of mouth. I thought nobody would come, but I thought that the stakes were so high that really, if I felt a little foolish when nobody came, it really was not the end of the world. And about 25 people turned up, and I told them everything I knew about what was happening to the planet, about global warming, about sea level rise, about ice melt, about biodiversity loss, and so on. And they said, let's do something, let's start an organization. And somebody came up with a name for it, which was Ambleside Action for a Future, or AFAF. And I organized the next monthly meeting, and that was it. And before very long, we were a registered charity. And then COVID came along, but we continued meeting on Zoom. And so we're still going. We're still going strong. But to my amazement, I did not say, let's start a group.
So you didn't intentionally start a community, you just did.
I did not intentionally. I just wanted to raise the alarm. I just wanted people to realize what was happening so that they might get involved and do something to avert what was happening. But I imagined them being galvanized to be more active, to become, but that wasn't what happened. They set up a group which is much more low-key, which is much more parochial in the best sense.
And what does that look like then? That, you know, when you describe it as parochial, what does that look like?
Well, there are different sections. There's a growing and biodiversity section, and there's a transport section. There's a water section. There's we have a comms group, obviously, to sort of publicize what we do, events and so on. And we do local things, you know, that's what I mean by parochial. I mean, we plant trees, we've planted an orchard in the park. We maintain trees because some farmers get grants for planting trees, but then they don't really have time to do all the tree maintenance, so a lot of them are lost. So we do tree maintenance. We every year we've just had a big event where we all donate plants and seedlings and so on, and for local residents, and we give them away free. So we've just given away over 400 plants to people in the town to start getting people growing vegetables, pollinators, herbs. And we're looking at getting a big piece of land, not buying it, but probably just borrowing it in a way from someone who has land, and starting a community garden, because I think it's urgent that we start growing our food.
Wow. And I'm kind of thinking about, the first time I met you, and I mean, I don't live too far away from you, but you live in a stunning place, which is the Lake District, and not everybody will know what the Lake District is, but it's a beautiful natural environment in the north of England,
Yes,
and
national park.
And a national park, and actually, and you live in the national park. And so when I first started kind of coming to see you, I was visiting every month this national park and the environment and so on. So when this started to happen around the fracking, I can imagine that, this, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, for me, you were very connected to the land.
Yes.
So for instance, I could have kind of gone to see other people in different places for for my work, for my supervision, for my therapy even. But actually coming to visit you, who was very connected to the land, was an integral part of my experience as well. And so that, so the story you tell of you looking after the land and you feeling like you're a voice for the land, it feels very it's very moving for me, because you've embodied that, you've kind of found that voice, whereas I think a lot of people are not necessarily able to do that, or they're not maybe as connected to the land in terms of understanding how important that is. It's like this is not something that's happening which won't affect us. It will. It's our land as well. It's not just land owned by corporations, if you like, or the government and so on as well.
Yes, well, I think that's true. My connection to the land, my connection to nature, it's a huge part of my everyday, and always has been, really, because I was brought up in a fairly, remote little cottage out on the edge of a village, and with salt marshes all around and woods, and have always felt, since almost I could walk, a very deep connection with nature, which only intensifies now as we are in danger of losing everything. Yes. So, and I think you're right that many people don't have that connection because they don't have the opportunity, because they just don't see. I mean, when I say my concern since the 70s, 80s, 90s, especially in the 90s, I saw changes. I registered changes in how soon spring started and so on. And a little bit like my friend when she said nobody's bothered about this report, I felt nobody's bothered. Nobody sees what's happening. So few people see what's happening, but I could see it daily in the environment right outside my window, and
Yeah.
I've been watching it ever since. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And
so
that resonates with me, because although I didn't live, directly on the land. It was very much kind of on an estate, out of town. But there was a kind of a woods behind our house, so I used to spend, as a child, all my time in the woods, and there was lots of birds. And I think, when we look at it now, I in terms of where I used to live, that really noticing the loss of the birds and the habit, the creatures, so when I had my children, we'd have to actually go looking for them. I didn't have to go looking for them as a child. And I suppose you can kind of think, well, that's because I'm living somewhere else. And you kind of tell yourself a story. But actually, in reality, it's like, no, actually, these things are disappearing. So I'm really captivated by the fact that, and these things, life happens this way, doesn't it? You didn't intentionally say, I'm going to set up a community, or I'm not intentionally being an activist. It's like something drew you, and so, and this is one of the things that I'm talking about in our community is, as an elder, these are the things that happen because, if you like, you have this calling and you follow that calling.
yes,
So you were called. You felt this calling, this urge, and they're my words, not yours, to do something, not necessarily set up a community, but just to do something.
do something, yes, to do something. And yes, I probably wouldn't have chosen really to set up a group. I mean, as you said, I've done a lot of leading groups, but if I'm honest, I'm not very good working in groups unless I'm leading them. It's not my strong suit, really. But I've learned a lot, often painfully now, about being part of an organization. I mean, I was seen in a way as the catalyst. I was seen as the founder. When we became a charity and had to have trustees, I became chair of trustees because it seemed like the obvious thing. But I am so much not a committee person. So that has been a tremendous learning curve. And I'm much more, I must do something. And on my own, unilaterally. So to be part of an organization has been, yes, a lot of learning. And part of the learning has been really beginning to appreciate other people's skills, I'm not a detailed person. I've really appreciated people who can pay attention to detail, people who know about protocols and rules and what forms you have to fill in and so on, without which, as a charity, we couldn't really function. And I think, I can be very impatient with all those things, but I've come to really, really be grateful for those people who are willing to sit down with the detail, with the nitty-gritty and so on. And that, in turn, that appreciating and realizing the value of other people's contributions and other people's experience and skills I'm not sure, it slowed me down a little. It's made me more considered. In a therapeutic setting, I can be very considered and very totally observing and quiet in a way to really see what's going on. But in other settings in life, I tend to be very speedy, impatient. Yes, irritated by detail by all that. So that's been a big shift, and a very important shift, because it doesn't just apply to that group that I'm part of. It makes me see that more widely in the world, that all those contributions are so important, and things wouldn't go on without everybody's input in the field. I mean, it does relate very much to my attraction to Gestalt, because if you think about there's a field, you know, and everybody has a different point in the field, and each of those different people, or each of those different personalities, or each of whatever they bring, creates the field. It isn't the same without, if even one of them goes, it changes. So yeah, so we're creating a field in which we recognize one another, and it's very different. It's very different for me. I've never really, I mean, when you name those things I've done, if I look back, I was a teacher, but you're in charge. I had a vegetarian restaurant, but it was mine, and I was in charge. And of course, I had to work with staff, and that was great, actually. That was, but I was in charge. What I said would be done. I didn't have to consult or really. And for a long time in my life, I think I've been very, very impatient with committees. I just want to do what I want to do. I can't delay gratification. I just want to get on and do it. So realizing that things might have to slow down has been particularly difficult because of the urgency of what I see as the situation.
Yeah.
The urgency. And we're fiddling about thinking, you know, what little bit of thing we have to fill in for the charity commission, and I hold the sense of urgency, and really the sense of well, a very extreme form of urgency in a way. So that's made this learning particularly difficult, I think.
Because that feels like it's holding some kind of tension. As you say that, it feels like holding in the tension, because where people are, like you say, needing the detail, or they've got to go through the bureaucracy or whatever, but at the same time, like you say, keeping that sense of pressure on to make sure that it keeps moving.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's very interesting. And kind of, I'm just wondering how you may have brought this to bear in community, because obviously I've experienced you as a teacher and a therapist as well. And one of the things that kind of drew me to you and kept me with you, and one of the reasons I asked you to be, you know, my therapist, was that you had this amazing ability to hold a safe space. Amazing. So, you know, and I've done, like you, I've done lots of Gestalt training. I've done lots of Gestalt groups. You know, before I met you, I'd been in a therapy group for 7 years, and that was a real killer for me, because like you, I from being a very young age, I led a group, or I wasn't in it. It's as simple as that, and found a way of working and getting paid to do that. So actually being in a therapy group was excruciating for me. But it was when I came to you and your group, and your groups, should I say. It wasn't one group, it was many groups that you've done work with in Constellations. Your ability to create that safe space, Gillian, was absolutely amazing, and still is kind of the place that I reach back to as my role model for that, and even kind of the skills that I learned from you in terms of being able to hold in that space. But at the same time, one of the other things that I noticed is I suppose that maybe that sense of urgency. I don't think I'd have described it that way, but that sense of you being able to hold the power within the group without misusing the power. So, bringing that authority, if you like, maybe the power is a funny word, I think, in this context, but holding in that space of authority where it kind of settles everybody down because we know that someone's holding that container. Someone's
Yes,
holding that container.
yes. And yes.
And I wonder how did you bring that maybe to your community?
It's a really good question because, of course, one of the basic differences between being in the community, because one of my very conscious aims with this group, because I now think we're not working to avert a catastrophe. I think we are working to face it.
Mm.
And that's why I think community is so important. And I think building kindness is so important. And I think bringing disparate people together is really important. But the big difference, I think, with, say, being in a workshop setting where you say, I hold a safe space, but I also take the authority, is that in a workshop setting, I have a contract with the group. They come, the fact that they sign up to a group led by me means I'm the leader. And I'm just wondering if that transfers to this, real life group out in the community. They have not contracted to accept, to let me lead, and I have not consciously offered to lead, even though I might have the position of chair of trustees, which I don't have now. I've just stepped back, but I've had that for 5 years.
Do you think that though maybe unconsciously they did choose you as their leader? It may not have been a conscious decision or a contracted decision, but I was wondering whether, them saying to you at the time, you obviously stepped up to kind of bring the community together in a way to look at something. But in then kind of asking you to, on some level, kind of, set something up or found this or be the founder.
Yes.
Do you think on some level they did actually choose you to be their
Yes,
leader?
maybe. I find that, yes, I think they probably did. I know that people say, articulate that. They say, thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for making this happen. Thank you for keeping us on track. But certainly, I think there's much more disparity in the group. I don't think everybody is on the same page as me in relation to the climate crisis or the planetary crisis. And that also is challenging for me. I notice the differences in a way. I notice the differences very sharply. I observe them. And I sometimes think, should I bring more somehow of what I bring to a constellations group? But it doesn't really seem of course I must bring something. Of course I must bring something. And yes, that I mean I am seen as the one who's had the vision. Often people say that you have the vision, you sort of understood, you have the knowledge and so on. But there are people who I can feel a reaction if I say where I am in relation to this coming catastrophe. And there's a conflict in me. I mean, you talked earlier informally when we were talking about how difficult it is to build a community and what gets in the way and so on. And I can feel a conflict in me between trying to hold together very disparate visions and views and expectations and speaking my own truth.
Yeah. Yeah, I can feel that. Again, that's another tension, isn't it? That's an interesting dynamic to kind of hold in. And is in that, is there a fear that if you did tell your truth, that if you like, there would be a collapsing of the container, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I think there might be several levels of fear about that. Yes, first of all, the container might not hold if I'm too outspoken. On a very personal level, I might be seen as some kind of weird Cassandra. But it feels also vital to me that I speak my truth. It feels like what I am called to do. And I think as I'm speaking, I think, well, how am I managing that? And I think I'm just about managing it because of love, really. Because although we may not see things in the same way or not have quite the same opinions, I love the people. And but it's hard not to get pulled from the love by that level of opinions and how people see things and my maybe wanting them to see things how I see things. So I think that's been another really important element of learning how to be there, how to go on working side by side, how to build the kindness.
Yeah.
Because I think we're going to need each other, and I think we're going to need to be kind and to really understand what's going on. And then all those other differing opinions do become much less weighty, much less important.
Yeah. I wonder too whether, kind of, because you're living in your community, in this community as well, a kind of, it's
yes.
there's always a risk there, isn't there?
It's a wonderful point that you make. I hadn't really thought of that. I mean, yes, it's not like going to a workshop and being with people for a weekend and we all go in our different directions. I'm living here. So I meet the people in the group, I bump into them day to day. Some of them are in other groups with me. A handful of people are in my singing group, for example. So I really am living with them. and seeing them in different contexts and having different roles in those different contexts.
Mm.
You know, they might be in charge of something I'm in. I don't think anybody is at the moment, but they could be, you know, so it's much more fluid as well.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
And I have to be, I mean, it's a funny thing to say, it feels very, but I have to be ordinary. So I can't be I am very limited in how much I can be all those things you mentioned, like the holder of the safe space and, you know, holding authority. And I do feel, because I do see things clearly, I do feel I have a responsibility to lead in some way, but I have to lead by being very ordinary and trying to hold my truth and trying to find ways of communicating that are accessible and will not, well, so far, that will not alienate me.
Mm.
But I can see that there may come a moment when I have to separate.
Mm.
But maybe not, because the sort of collapse of things is going on all around us now, and it's becoming much more obvious. So
Yeah. And I suppose because you've now stepped away from, you know, the kind of that role in the community as well, and that group, you might be able to kind of voice things that you couldn't voice while you're in the group. Because I think this is the other thing, isn't it? Sometimes when we are holding a place and a position within a system,
yeah,
it can sometimes be hard to tell our truth. Whereas if we separate away from it, it's easy. And I certainly know from my experience I often end up the outlier in groups and communities, because I always feel the need. I need to be holding on to my own truth in this and not get kind of absorbed in either this group thinking in an unconscious way and just going along with things, or even feeling in this terrible conflict where I feel like, it feels unsafe to be here because actually I've got another point of view that's very much going to risk my belonging here as
yes,
well.
it's amazing how much power and how quickly some kind of group or institution or organization, somehow the well-being of the organization or the integrity of the organization um, can be seen more important than what was the original motive, you
Yes.
know, for setting it up. And then when you start, I think it's very, very perceptive what you say. And then when you start to feel that you're limited, and you can only speak your truth if you step away, that's tricky. I
Yeah.
mean, I haven't stepped away. I'm still part of it, but I'm not doing as much as I was doing.
Mm.
Because it's quite hard. It's
Yeah.
quite hard to
And
do.
so for me, this is one of the things that I feel is part of eldership, is to be able is to make sure we hold a place that we can always tell that truth, but one of the things that we have to have in my sense, in my vision of this, is other elders to keep us kind of belonging to, to me. And so it's almost like if we belong to other elders, it allows us to speak truth in these different communities and different groups in a much safer way. Because
Mhm.
we don't belong to that. We belong to a group of elders who also are no longer part of these systems or needing to belong in them in the same way as they did
Mm,
as
mm.
well. But I also kind of just want to recognize, well, you mentioned your children and your grandchildren there as well. So there's another, in kind of potential risk that can happen in communities where there's other parts of our extension of ourselves that are also part of those communities as well. So we may have kind of our friends in those communities, or we may have our family in those communities. So suddenly there's another difficult tension in terms of, are we not just risking our belonging, but theirs too?
I didn't think about that. That's very true. Yes, I have one half of my family is in this community here. Yeah, and fortunately they live fairly separate. I don't think if I in any way outraged Ambleside Action for the Future, or I don't think it would have a huge effect. But you're right. I mean, there are so many yes, I mean, it brings up a whole question, doesn't it, about disagreeing, disparity, how we deal with that, how we deal with disagreement and still stay true to what we see and feel with great conviction. And I mean, there's a lot of the word community is around a lot at the moment. Do you find that?
Yes, and from my experience, people talk about it, but don't really understand what they're saying when they're talking about it. I think the word is often attached to things that are not communities, or or people have idolized what they think a community is even.
Or romanticize what they think a community is, or say there used to be community spirit, or I mean, here in the Lake District, there's very much in the bit I live in, there's still very much a sense of community. The community that was here before I even came, which is I've already been here 47 years, but there's a community that was here, which is indigenous, really, we could say. And there is something really good about that community. Everybody knows everybody knows everybody's history, everybody knows everybody's peculiarities, everybody knows everybody's strengths, everybody knows everybody's weaknesses. But the community holds because people have lived in the same place.
So it's the land.
And yes, and created things together, created events together, created a village hall together, this, I mean, if we just use Ambleside Action, I'll call it AFAF, as an example, it's come together, and it's the basis for it is one of the elements in it is stress. It's meeting a very, very, the most stressful situation we could meet, not just going on day to day. So that again means there are very intense feelings and convictions around, and but some of what is building, because it is building, I think, applies. Some of what I see in what I'm calling the indigenous community applies because we get to know each other more and more. We get to know each other's peculiarities. We get to know each other's strengths. We get to know each other's weaknesses. And we just keep going on, and we adapt, and we use what's useful, and we smile at the peculiarities or whatever. And so there is a sense of community building, but it's always fragile, I think, community, it's always, because of all those things we see in the world, especially now, especially with the world leaders who are coming up, you know, this craving for power, this inability to let go of power, this inability to give a role to the person who's most suitable, not the person who's most pushy, you know, all that competitiveness, envy, jealousy, and so on. As I say that, I must say that in AFAF, it is, there's not a lot of that. There's hardly any of that, actually. But often, you know, that's just good luck, I think.
And do you think there's a lot of elders within that particular group and that community?
Yes. Yes. The younger people, well, we're a small population, really, and people do come here to retire. And so people are mainly 50 plus. There's a few people who are younger, age-wise. And there are some, yes. I think that is probably one of the reasons why there isn't a lot of that sort of competition, because there are quite a number of people who are wiser.
Yeah.
Who are wiser, who
I mean, I notice when I kind of visit the community, obviously not that specific one, but just generally in that the area is, you know, there's a lot of creativity, and again that there's a lot of people who are very attuned with nature and are very much kind of connected to the land as well. So they seem to be much more earthy kind of people who live there as well.
Yes, the people who've lived there a long time are often earthy. Yeah.
So one of the things that I just wanted to kind of end with in a way was I don't know whether you've heard of the book, When Women Rose Rooted. When Women Rose Rooted.
Rose Rooted.
Yeah, it's by Sharon Blackie.
Right.
And she has some beautiful oracle cards that I like to use within our community. So I always choose one for our kind of podcasts, or if we're in groups and so on, just to see what kind of comes up. And intuitive, the one that I chose today was reclaiming the feminine. See that?
Oh, yes.
Reclaiming the feminine.
Wonderful.
And as is always, you know, so wonderful when you use these oracle cards, they just kind of summarize that up beautifully, because, you know, one, again, coming back to kind of my connection to you, one of the obviously I'd experienced you with the group work and constellations, but when I was training with John Whittington and came up against an entanglement, he said to me, you really do need to find a woman to work with, because I think there's something around mother energy you need to do some healing around. And that's when I reached out to you, because I thought, well, actually, and so this kind of card of reclaiming the feminine very much kind of, for me, was my connection to you. So and kind of, you know, the inspiration that you've brought to me. So I'm just going to read a little bit about what it says about reclaiming the feminine from this card.
Yes.
And it's particularly talking about women and feminine in this context, but obviously men have the feminine energy as well. But it says a core task in a woman's journey through life is to discover and then integrate the feminine principle, which has been repressed over countless centuries. It's an antidote to the masculine principle, whose qualities have dominated our cultural discourse here in the West for far too long. We need the feminine to balance out that dogged drive for success and progress. and devotion to intellectual, rational, and goal-orientated traits. Feminine qualities of relatedness enable us to appreciate and live in harmony with other humans, as well as the other than humans who share the planet with us. They enable us to appreciate the rhythms of the natural world, as well as the rhythms of our physical body and the cycles and seasons of our lives. These qualities of the feminine principle also include the instinctive, feeling qualities traditionally associated with the heart and the soul. But reclaiming the feminine isn't just about embracing all the things which make us feel good. We need to encounter the dark feminine too. This isn't necessarily the negative aspect of the feminine. Rather, it's the expression of the very necessary, creative, and chaotic energy which allows us to experience the full range of women's mysteries. This card invites us to delve deep, to uncover our inner source of female wisdom, and to embrace our own unique creativity and life-giving qualities in the spirit of both our own growth and our service to the world.
Lovely. Well, what I think was I have two thoughts. I mean, in response to that, just somehow you describe what I think you have taken forward beautifully is this creating a safe space and taking the power. And probably in very feminine power.
Yeah.
I think building community where I don't have a role, where we don't have a role, particularly out in the world, I could describe some of the learning that I've been talking about as learning to retrieve the feminine and to dare to be with the feminine, because I'm very, I have a lot of Mars energy, I have a lot of, so it's somehow learning how to find that power and that softness and that perception, and to rely on it out in the world in a different, where I don't have the protection of my role, really, such a strong protection. And maybe, a lot of us who are trying to build community in the world, it's very important, the feminine.
Yeah,
absolutely, because it's been so suppressed, and we are in this facing this catastrophe because of that. But that's no reason to give up on retrieving the feminine.
That's lovely. And the other thing that just kind of is coming to my awareness, Gillian, as well, is in Sharon Blackie's book, she talks about the women were the well keepers. And so they would tend the well and make sure the water supply was always pure and clear. And that was their role. And she talks about mythological stories, particularly English and Celtic stories about the women tending the wells until they were taken away from the wells by the men, by the kind of the patriarchal system where they took it away. And it's not lost on me that fracking, the risk of fracking is to contaminate the water supply.
Absolutely. I never thought about that before, and it was mainly women who got together to oppose it.
Yeah. So kind of the feminine intuition to know that, like, that is fatal. to
Yes.
contaminate that water, to anything to risk it. And I'm also conscious about what's happened recently in the news about the contamination, for instance, of Windermere.
Yes.
And of the water,
And
the water
rivers
in the
and
UK is been terribly contaminated
yeah,
as well. So
and it's interesting when you mention fracking and the water and the women, very much the women who came forward to oppose it, because that community of women is so bonded still, even though there isn't a cause around which they have gathered. The bonds I see on Facebook and everywhere, and they meet occasionally, and there's a tremendous bond among those women who were, as you say, protecting the water, protecting the purity of the water.
The water.
Yeah, which is the absolute necessity for life.
Exactly.
The absolute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So on that note, thank you so much for your work and your leadership in this space and your ongoing eldership, Gillian. Thank you so much for
thank you.
talking to me today.
It's an honour and it's an absolute delight to see you going forward with your work in such an inspiring way.
Thank you, Gillian. Take care.